Our next speaker is Farrel Corcoran, a long-time friend and supporter of community media, and we're very happy to have Farrel with us. And Farrel has been asked Farrel was former head of RTE and has been head of communications in DCU. You probably have all that in your brochure. And we've asked Farrel to sort of review, with his long-time experience of media, to just review the role of mainstream media so far in promoting social justice. So would you welcome, please, Farrel Corcoran.
Thanks very much, Jack. And first of all, I'd like to add my voice to the voices of congratulations to NUIM FM and everyone involved in this co-op in making it to this wonderful age of 30 years. It's fantastic. And I think in particular it's excellent that the celebration, if you like, takes the form today of speech and talking about the media. Because I've always found, especially when I was working in RTE, that one of the things seriously lacking in Ireland was an organised voice of people who are viewers and listeners. And I had occasion a few times to work with the British VLV organisation, the Voice of the Viewer and Listener. And you can see a huge difference over there. People organised around the country to such an extent that they're able to intelligently analyse and give good feedback to broadcasters. They're taken seriously by the BBC, they're taken seriously by ministers in London, and so on. And rarely have we come near that kind of organised feedback, organised voice. And when I was working on the RTE Authority, I often missed that when we were trying to make some changes. All we got was a big avalanche of media people, journalists giving us loads and loads and loads of feedback, some of it quite divisive and bitter and so on. But we weren't really hearing. I'm not talking about professionally gathered audience feedback figures, you know, quantitative surveys, that kind of stuff. But more people deliberating, taking a day like this to debate issues and to you know, give some critical, intelligent, creative talk to the very important subject of the media. As Jack says, the topic of my few words this morning was assigned to me. It was supposed to be about injustices of the mainstream media, and go back 50 years and take a look at this. So when I stood back and I said, hold on a second, where did this title come from? I had to say to myself that as an academic, I would have to relegate this to the realm of having about 6 PhDs look at this. And if you really want to have good evidence-based research done on social justice issues in the media or not in the media for the past several decades, it would certainly take at least.
Okay, we're just interrupting the speeches there for a little while because in studio I have Tom Murphy. Hello, Tom. Good morning. How are you?
Hello. Good morning.
Okay. Tell me about your involvement in NUIM FM first.
Well, I got involved with NUIM FM actually through the drama people, but my day job is in social media, and being a director of boards.ie, which is the largest social media in the country, the largest Irish-based social media. And as a result, I've done bits and pieces back and forth with NUIM in terms of discussing social media with them and being a commentator on it. But the idea of NUIM FM and the idea of people taking kind of control of the media into their own hands is something that's very close to my heart. The idea that people will step up and say, well, look, it's not that hard to kind of to take control.
Or
we don't have
capital.
to be
it would be called communication.
Of
it would be called communications. And I think many people today would agree with that. It's an extremely important area for us to analyse. So I want to spend, first of all, a few minutes just talking about the notion of media freedom and how it relates to social justice. The basic issues. For many years, if you look at where thinking about freedoms have come from in the tradition of philosophy, you'll find a very intimate connection between people arguing for greater media, before now it would have been press, freedom, and the development of democracy. And in the history of the press, in the history of print, if you want to go back a couple of hundred years to when it really took off in the coffee houses of Europe, from gossip sheets and people scribbling feedback on these sheets that were circulated in tea houses and coffee houses and so on, you see this idea of freedom being extremely important. I think we can look at this media freedom in two ways. One is in terms of structure, and we have to deal with this every day in this country. The structure of the media, how free is that structure? And then, of course, performance. What do people actually do with that freedom? Very, very crudely, it's the difference between the bottle and the wine that is inside in it. We can talk about the shape of the bottle. We can also talk about whether the wine is any good inside. One of the first problems that comes up, of course, is that many owners and controllers of media, because they own the container, the publication outlet, feel that they also can claim all rights over content. And that's an issue that has to be looked at. What are the main public benefits that I'm talking about in terms of this media freedom? First of all, I think we need an adequate and reliable supply of information about those in power. And that's been part of the history of the philosophy of looking at these issues for many, many, many years. What is power? The so-called watchdog role of the media. And I'm not just talking about political power. That's extremely important, of course. But I'm also looking at what sociologists nowadays are calling elites. Elites are people who are making the major decisions in every country and more cross-national borders. We find that there are now specialized media that deal with elite only. And if you look at the big issue of European politics and the criticism that there are democratic deficits in European politics and so on, you find that more and more, we find a very good newspaper like the Financial Times, for instance, and others as well, have no intention or no motivation to reach out to the general public. They're dealing with very, very small but very, very significant groups of people that, let's just call them the elite, people with economic power, people who make decisions in all kinds of ways. So what we're talking about, of course, is that the media, if they're free, have the ability to activate the social system, to re-energize it, or what I would be inclined to call the public sphere, following the great German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who talked about the public sphere, and it's a term that has caught on a lot in scholarship on media. It's linked to the right, the so-called right to communicate, to receive good quality information and to have access. This is not a complete right. Not everybody can walk into every radio station and TV station and claim to have the right to the airwaves, but nonetheless, it is there, potentially. The media, if properly free, of course, have the ability to renew culture and society, to renew it. We've only to look at recent history in Europe to see where renewal sometimes just falls very, 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 very short. I'm thinking of, say, dictatorships in recent times, Franco in Spain, Salazar in Portugal, and the way the whole culture, literature, and every other aspect of it was kind of run down and frozen because of, I would argue, the lack of free media there in order to be able to enliven the culture. And of course, there is a multiplier effect. If you have freedom of the media, it encourages and it enables all kinds of other freedoms to take place as well. The freedom of marginalized groups to come in, to be part of the general culture, and so on. Now, clearly there are big problems with structural conditions that can impinge on this kind of freedom. The obvious one is limits, the necessary limits that have to be placed on concentration of power, cross-ownership, the restricting of ownership to fewer and fewer hands. And if you look at this longitudinally across the world, and in particular in the developed parts of the world, you find the concentration of ownership is a really, really big issue. And of course, then that emerges into the performance of media workers. The conflict of interest there is between the owners of media and the questions of access and freedom of information and so on that is out there. Freedom from interference is extremely important for people who work in the media at every level, from community, public and commercial and other forms of the media. Freedom to do their work without interference from owners, from political interests, from economic interests. In my time in RTE, Michael D. Higgins, now our president, and I used to have this little joke where we'd meet fairly frequently at receptions or book launches or whatever it might be, and because of the very healthy environment at that time, I think, which was, I would call the freedom of information environment, anyone looking at the two of us who wanted to cause mischief might say, oh, there's an example of political interference. You see the politician, you see the minister whispering in the ear of the chairman of the public service organization. So Michael would always have the tact to say to me with a grin, I think I'll move away now. I need to keep my constitutional distance from you. And he would do that. There is freedom to have access to sources. And again, if you look back at the history of RTE, you can see, there's no need to rehearse it here, many people know all this stuff already. The difficulties in having access to sources in RTE's early history, for example, during the Biafran War in Nigeria, or the difficulties during the Vietnam War, when journalists were actually recalled. They were heading to try and get another view to escape the American filter on news and try and get some voices directly from North Vietnam, and that simply didn't work at all. One of the biggest problems we have, I suppose, when we look at the way media perform, the way they operate, is what media scholars will call indexation. And it's not something that we can just point the finger of blame at owners this time. It's the tendency across media to start reflecting, consciously or not, probably more subconsciously than consciously, but to start reflecting the views of those in power. Indexation, you find it very, very strong in the American media, even in the so-called good newspapers, if you think the New York Times is good or the Washington Post, where the major editorial line, the choice of topics, the framing of issues, more and more comes to resemble what is actually coming out of the White House or what is coming out of the major parties. It affects the media performance in a number of ways. Number one, I mentioned agenda setting. How are issues put onto the agenda of the media, and why are certain other issues kept off? There's plenty we could talk about there. Secondly, framing. What kind of a frame is put around issues? And what about the frames that were rejected, pushed away, didn't make it into the media performance arena at all? And thirdly, I suppose, the power of what we might call primary definition. The ability of certain people in a society to put the primary definition on something new that comes up, so that it's very difficult later on for journalists or other media workers to change that definition. They seem to be deviant, or they seem to be going against what has already been established as the truth. All of this, in terms of its relationship with social justice issues, brings us back to the notion of equality. If you have media freedom, you should have media equality. Now, that ultimately, I suppose, depends on the level of social and economic development in a society, as well as the capacity of the media to provide proper equality for all groups and all civil society memberships and so on to participate in the public sphere. But again, there are issues here. There are great difficulties. I would point, for example, to the United States, which seems to meet both conditions. Great media capacity and a fairly high level of social and economic development. And yet, many, many studies will point out that the quality of the public sphere and the notion of equality of access to good information in the United States is severely lacking. It's not at all a foregone conclusion because you've got so many media there. And in that case, I suppose we would have to say that the value is much higher in North American culture. The freedom of opportunity is valued higher than the notion of equality, economic or information equality. So that enlarging the number of channels does not necessarily mean we have better content, more diverse points of view, different points of view, diversity, and so on. It doesn't have to mean that. It is a precondition, however. And it's great when we look at how different media have developed. We can see the role also of technology. When I was a very young academic, I found myself in a place called Albuquerque, New Mexico, back in 1977, and it was very exciting then because the Americans were beginning to discover the value of community media. And we had a little community TV station in Albuquerque that was based around the simple fact that cable TV has suddenly arrived. That was the new media at that time, what cable could provide in the 70s. Local people getting together with low-cost resources, making material that filled in gaps that were not being filled by the big regular media. Now, I don't want to take too long, but I'll just add one more thing. If we look at the dark clouds that can emerge, and again, I'm thinking of my 6 PhD people getting to work on this for the next 4 years to actually put some flesh on how we have performed in this country in terms of social justice issues. I would have to say also you must look at the issue of mediatization. Just a word on mediatization, because it can influence all media, I would argue including community media, if we're not very, very careful. And I think it is a result of the impact of competition on all media, both in terms of the content of the media and the form in which that content is expressed. And it comes about because sometimes when we have too many media, the voice, the general voice tends to act in consonance rather than getting enough diversity. What I mean, for example, is the tendency in many media to favor stuff like dramatic narrative, compelling characters, where there is a premium put on action and surprise and excitement and emotional involvement in the media content, and compelling visuals, okay? And if something in the real world does not fit into that kind of paradigm, then it tends to be excluded. It tends not to get covered. The criteria of newsworthiness, for example, when a journalist goes out in the morning and considers, okay, what is newsworthy? This is where this mediatization phenomenon can cut in. It's not really about the real world. How important is that issue? It's more about media aspects, the form of the media and what is expected back home when the story is put together. We saw a very, very, in my mind, very sad and very compelling example of this in the debacle in RTE in recent times with the primetime program Mission to Pray, which did a lot of damage to people outside of RTE. Obviously, it did a lot of damage within RTE itself, and it was very, very costly. But we could see in the analysis that was done later on, why did such a flawed program go out? The basic reason, I think, was mediatization, this pressure to do things in a certain way, and that had got a grip in certain parts of the primetime team. We find it also in the way the news media, especially in broadcasting, handle interview style. Their interview style, when they get a politician like Pat Rabbitt into the hot seat, what is the way in, or other people, what is the way in which the politician or other important person is being interviewed? Well, very often it is adversarial. And sometimes you'd wish, let's not get adversarial. Can we not have a discussion about this? Tease out the issues. It is fast-paced. There's no time. You know, the clock is ticking. Or it is confrontational. Or the scoop, getting the scoop first before the opposition or before the alternative is very important. Or something is framed in terms of what media scholars call episodic framing, rather than thematic framing, where you take a theme and you spend enough time to tease it out fully. With mediatization, you don't do that. The pressure is to be fast, adversarial, confrontational, and so on. What is missing then, if we say mediatization is a real problem in public service broadcasting? I don't know about community media, but I think it's well worth taking a good look at that as well, and certainly in purely commercial media. Well, one thing that's missing is wordiness. Suppose you have somebody who has a lot to say, but they're a little bit too wordy. Too many words, slower pace. they tend not to get access again to the media. Their explanations are too long, too detailed, too complex, too abstract for the medium that they're using. Or maybe the ideas that they're tossing around are too unfamiliar. So we can't deal with this because it would cause a blockage with the audience, a perceived blockage. Or there is too much historical background needed, this person who wants to contribute. And we don't want that because we're into speedy, fast delivery of snippets. Too much explanation and so on is bad. And of course, this also influences, I think, this mediatization phenomenon, influences would-be contributors to the media, as well as people who are training to be producers and directors and journalists and so on. And I think it also influences people, perhaps in public life, who are being trained in media relations in places like car communications and so on. There's a particular way to do it, and there's a way you should not do it. And sometimes the dividing line is on this issue of mediatization. So I leave it at that. I think the big, broad issues that we can talk about are the difficulties of performing in the world where there is a tendency always towards concentration and the tightening up of ownership. But I think we should also look at the downstream effect of having so many media available to us, this mediatization that goes on. You can also see it operating where we have a moral panic. If you have a moral panic, for instance, about crime rates, if you analyze that, it is frequently that something has started in one medium, one newspaper, but it chains out and it's picked up and it's covered in much the same dramatic but superficial kind of a way by all kinds of other media as well. So I'll wrap up there. Again, thanks very much to Jack for inviting me, and congratulations on getting here. I would leave you with one serious idea. When I go back to the notion of VLV, the voice of the listener and viewer in Britain, I was most impressed with the fact that when you look at a media system in a country, you have to also look at to what extent are citizens organized into thoughtful, reflective, critical consumers, if you like, but also people who are going to give feedback to policymakers. And we're very poor at that in Ireland. There is a real role in a day like this and in the people who organised a day like this. There should be more of it. Well done, and it's great that it's happening. Thanks very much.